some interesting things every once in a while that says that they were asking the questions we're asking. For example, with the that particular lesson, what was he writing in the dirt? And the scribe wrote out in the margin the sins of them all.
Yeah, well, and every once in a while you'll get, scribes who are trying to figure things out, so they'll write their own little notes going on, and then those notes get copied down as notes, and they get passed down. Because again, when later scribes are going through and copying these, they copy everything that is in the manuscript. They don't say, oh, well, that's a footnote, so I'm not going to put, no. If it's on the page, even if they are 100% sure, and there's a few of these in the Old Testament that the scribes are like, we are 100% confident that this is wrong. But that's a note in the margin because what they were given has it that way. And so they copied it that way. And there's a lot of checks and balances in the way they would do these things. I think it's always fun. There's these footnotes at the end of every book in the Hebrew Old Testament that tells you how many words there are and how many letters there are. The central letter of the book is in bold, and that was all to help the scribes double check. They would count the letters, and if they had the wrong number of letters on a page, because they knew it for the page, the lines, everything, then they would scrap it and start over. So the fun thing, so most of the guys that I did Hebrew with had the one you have, I believe, this tiny little book. Well, it's a very small size. I got a big, large print version of the Hebrew Bible, but the page numbers are exactly the same. And the first and last words are always exactly the same. It's just scaled to be larger because they don't want to, the tradition says that you don't mess around with the page numbers or anything. So, but that's not at all what we're talking about today. So, all right. We are going to continue down our series here, looking at the various miracles that John records. Last week we talked about, obviously, the first of the miracles, the changing of water into wine at the wedding at Cana. We talked also a little bit about, kind of in general, why does the Bible talk about miracles? Why does God use miracles? And we landed on a lot of reasons, but kind of all boiling down in one way or another to God uses miracles to reveal himself. And we see that in the first miracle of Jesus, right? Just as the miracles of the Old Testament revealed God, Jesus reveals himself as God through this first miracle, and his disciples believe in him as Lord and Savior. And we're going to see that continuing on in today's lesson as well as we go to the healing of the official's son. Certainly not as famous of a miracle as the changing of water into wine at Cana. And there's a not small chance that if you're thinking that you know what miracle this is, you might be thinking of the wrong one. Because there's another miracle that's very similar and I think a little bit more famous than this one. But who knows, you might have this one pegged away and ready to go. Well, before we dive into today, are there any remaining questions or thoughts or anything from last week? With the wedding at Cana. See, it looks like a number of you have a question. You just don't want to ask it, but that's okay. I'll let it slide here. So today we're going to be in John chapter 4. So the wedding at Cana is in John chapter 2. So we have a little bit of time that elapses in between Jesus' first miracle and his second miracle. And as I said, we're going to pay a lot of attention to the structure that John used to put the book together, specifically looking at miracles here. And so I guess what might be worth doing, since we're not going to read 2 chapters of John just in preparation for this today, I want us to kind of we'll make use of the headings here. So let's take a look at the headings and kind of see what are the events, if you will, that take place in between the wedding at Cana and the healing of the official's son. So the headings, at least in mine, right? We go from the wedding at Cana straight into Jesus cleansing the temple, right? Which either he does this twice or John has put something at the end of the ministry here, right? But what is relevant for today is, where does Jesus cleanse the temple? The sound is a weird question, but I'm making a point. Where is the temple that Jesus cleanses? It's in Jerusalem, right? Okay. And so we have Jesus in Jerusalem. Right, and as we go forward, we have Jesus talking to Nicodemus, right, which is, one of those famous stories. This is where we get, gospel in a nutshell, being born again of water, for God so loved the world, all of that. Then we have John the Baptist kind of exalting Jesus as Christ. The story of Jesus going to Samaria and interacting with that woman at the well. Remember, he's at a well in the middle of the day. A Samaritan woman comes out and he says, give me some water. I'll give you the water that, when you drink of it, you'll never be thirsty again. And then he sends her on his way after she comes to faith, recognizing that he is the Savior, right? And now today we move into, so John 4, my heading starts at verse 46. It might be worth starting at verse 43. Jesus is moving around. And what we see throughout this intervening section is a number of vignettes that emphasize how people are reacting to Jesus, right? I mean, Jesus is interacting with them, to be sure, right? But how are the people reacting to Jesus cleansing the temple?
Somewhat.
Well, okay, there's a little bit of a so what. They're not happy with it, right? And so we see Jerusalem is already at the very beginning, right? The city that should be accepting the prophet, right? And I'm using Old Testament terminology. We know Jesus is more than a prophet, right? Is rejecting him. And we'll see this more so. We see also, not necessarily in the intervening section, right? Jesus is rejected in Nazareth, his hometown. But where is he accepted? Where's that woman? Where is she? In Samaria, right? The people who aren't supposed to be, right? They're not looking to the same Messiah. How much we got? I taught on the Samaritans like 6 years ago, so I'm sure you all remember everything that I said about the Samaritans, right? So who are the Samaritans? What's going on with these people? I think it's worth us remembering. Who are the Samaritans?
A lot of them were people that were taken away by Assyria and then brought back.
So there's a portion of that. It's not that they were brought back. They kind of meandered their way back during the intertestamental time. Yep.
And other people that Assyria resettled there.
Right.
Itself resettled people there.
Yeah. So ethnically, what are the Samaritans?
Mixed up.
Yeah, everyone's kind of mixed up at this point, right? Ethnicities in general are a little mixed up. But primarily, what ethnicity are the Samaritans? Ooh, this is a good question. Joe, what are they?
They're really a mixture of Gentile and Jewish population.
Right.
And their religion reflects that same kind of mixed-upness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Samaritans come from a splinter group during the intertestamental period and kind of rally around a rival to the priesthood that gets kind of kicked out. It's way more complicated than that. I taught you all that 6 years ago. I'm sure you remember it, right? But where that group, which has Jewish origins, founds a second temple, if you will, in contrast to the second temple that was built in Ezra and Nehemiah in what is now Samaria, right? Mount Gerizim? Yeah, Mount Gerizim that they built it on. And through the intertestamental period, there's confusion, or disagreement, I would say, between the Jews and the Samaritans as to, one, who is the true lineage, because they would both say it's us, right? Even though it doesn't seem like it would be. And they both very much deny the lineage of the other, right? As well as where the Messiah would come from and where worship is proper, right? So do you worship on the Temple Mount or do you worship on Mount Gerizim, right? Jesus interacts with this question and says, well, neither. You worship in spirit and truth, right? And me is the answer to that. So the Samaritans are a somewhat Jewish group, but that's not dissimilar to saying that the Herodians are an Abrahamic group. Yes, it's true, but that in some ways makes it so that they are more likely to not get along with the Jewish people, right? The Herodians, what line do they come from? Do you guys know? What ethnicity are the Herodians? They're Edomites. And who's the patriarch of the Edomites? Esau, right? And they also have claims and counterclaims. So really, I mean, what is now known as Judea by the time of Jesus, just because the Romans are the ones in charge and have called it that, is really an ethnic, I'm going to say it this way, it's an ethnic mess of people who don't like each other and all have various claims and counterclaims to who the true people of God are, and they have a lot of historical baggage, right? The Jews and the Edomites have this really long-standing beef, because basically when the Assyrians and Babylonians came through, the Edomites were like crouching on the border, laughing as the Jewish people were being led into exile, and then ran to go take their stuff. And the Jews never really forgot that. Just to, tie a bow around this whole thing. As far as political power around this time, obviously Rome's top dog. Who is of those three people groups, who's the next in influence and control? Is it the Samaritans, the Jews, or the Herodians, which are the ruling class of Edomites? It is the Herodians. Do you guys know why? It's because the Herods made buddy-buddy with Rome, and the Jews didn't. That's all it really comes down to. There used to be, until right before Jesus is born, a Jewish kingdom called the Hasmonean dynasty. That's gone because the Hasmoneans did not make buddy-buddy with Rome, and the Herodians did. So they went out. Who's next on the social ladder, if you will?
Jews.
The Jews. And then kind of at the bottom are the Samaritans. They're the most, well, of these three at least, they're the most ostracized group. And so when we see in John, right, we talked about how John is very simple language, and yet it's very shocking. We see this tension between who is believing and who is not, right? We've already hit the tension of the word became flesh and how that would have blown Greek minds, right? Well, today, not today, in this intervening section, we've seen the people of Jerusalem, the people of Nazareth, right, where the Messiah is coming from. They're the people that are rejecting Jesus. And the people from the backwater nowheres, Galilee being one of them, and Samaria being another that we interact with here, they're the ones accepting Jesus. And so John is showing how things are being turned around and turned on their head through this opening section of the book of John. Questions before we dive into our actual miracle account for today?
Yeah, Samaritans, what books of the Bible did they have? They have the five books of Moses?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, Joe, you're going to tell me.
It's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. It was written in a little different script
Right.
than the Hebrew canon. And the biggest difference is the references to the place where God will cause his name to dwell. Gerizim was mentioned.
Yeah, I was going to say, none of them are one for one. It's the same. From what I understand, it's a different script, and it leans more on the oral tradition or less on the oral tradition. That I don't remember. But yeah, and Samaritans are still around, by the way. There's really not many of them anymore. It's a very small group, but they do still exist. Where they stand with all these things is probably like most things, and they have a whole bunch of different opinions about a whole bunch of different things, right? But yeah, so the Samaritans have this like tenuous kind of connection, kind of like the stepbrother of the family that, everyone kind of, the black sheep stepbrother, no one really wants to talk about. Is kind of the vibe you got going on, and yet they're not only is Jesus going to them, which was a big social faux pas, right? You don't go to unclean people like the Samaritans, right? But they're accepting him, and then this is also why, by the way, the Good Samaritan is such an impactful story, because there's a Jewish person who is harmed on the road, and the Jewish people ignore them while the Samaritan helps them and aids them, the one rejected, right? And so this is not a class on parables, although it almost was. I was between the two, right? But it's not a class on parables because there's way too many of them. I would have known how to pick them. But that's kind of what's going on culturally when Jesus is speaking these parables. Good. Any other questions before we hit the miracle for today? All right, today we have the healing of the official's son. I think probably the best way to do this one's not quite as well defined in its structure as the wedding at Cana was. So I think what I want to do, we have one or two volunteers to read the whole account. We'll just do the whole thing all at once and then we can reference back. So I have one or one half of a volunteer for this.
I'll read it.
The whole thing, or you want some help, Denise?
I don't know. See, I'm
All right, you keep going until you're ready to be done, then we'll grab someone else. I want you to start at 46.
46,
Chapter 4 of
46.
John 4. Yeah, just do 46.
Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee in Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. Unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, Jesus told him, you will never believe. The royal official said, Sir, come down before my child dies. Jesus replied, You may go, your son will live. The man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, The fever left him yesterday at the 7th hour. Then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, Your son will live. So he and all his household believed. This was the second miraculous sign that Jesus performed, having come from Judea to Galilee.
Thank you. Well done. So, before we dive into the actual text, there's another miracle that's not in John, it's in the Synoptic Gospels, that is very similar to this one. Does anyone know what it is? It's the healing of the centurion's servant, right? So, here's the question. Is this the same miracle? Or is this a different miracle?
Different.
Why do you say different, Tom?
Because one from Capernaum, one's a centurion.
Okay, so
Different people.
it is, while there have been interpreters going all the way back in history that say this is a different account of the same miracle, in all likelihood this is a different miracle, right? One of the main reasons is the official from Capernaum is not a centurion. We'll talk a little bit about his likely identity. We don't have a good, solid fix. We're not told exactly who he is, but not a centurion, right?
And the centurion, didn't he say, instead of this guy saying, come with me, he says, just say the word.
Absolutely. So we have, this man insists, no, Jesus, you have to come to my house to heal him. Whereas the centurion says, don't you dare come to my house, right? I don't deserve to have you there. You just tell him to be healed, right? Absolutely. Good. There's some other differences. You catch
Servant
them?
versus son.
A servant versus a son, right? Absolutely. Now, this one's not quite as well defined because you could refer to your son as your servant as well, depending on station and that sort of thing. But I mean, we see this distinction being made later. You know, he is no longer calls us servants; he calls us sons, that sort of thing. So while that's possible, it's unlikely. And so, yeah, we have different terms for who is in need of healing. And then let's see. I think I had one more. Yeah, we got the place, the person, the exhortation. There's one more difference that's pretty critical between them, which is hard since we didn't read the other one, right? And that is the exhortation that Jesus gives. right? So in the healing of the centurion's son, this was one of the VBS stories we did this year. And when I was teaching the story to the kids, I did it something like this. The centurion comes up to Jesus and says, can you heal my slave? And Jesus ignored him, turned to everyone else, and was like, man, this guy has way more faith than you. Yeah, taken care of, right? Jesus commends the deep faith of the centurion in his response. And here we get a different response, right? Which is certainly not that deep commendation, not condemnation, but that it's different. We're going to talk specifically about how Jesus responds here. But there's a very different response that Jesus gives. So it is still technically possible that this is the same miracle, but it is extremely unlikely, and in all likelihood, this is a separate miraculous event, right? Which again kind of reminds us of that fundamental question that I want to go in through your minds as we read these, which is, and later I'll make you supply the question to me, but this is the second lesson, so I'll just tell you again, don't worry. That question is, why does John include this miracle? As in this case, we even have a direct corollary, right? Not the same miracle. Why did John include this healing of a person's son from a long distance rather than the centurion, right? Why did John choose to include this one? Because John doesn't include the healing of the centurion's son. It's not in here. And so why does he include this rather than that, right? And we shouldn't be surprised that the healing of the centurion's son isn't in here, right? Remember, Jesus did many other signs and wonders. They won't fit in the book, all that kind of stuff. But what is the fundamental principle that we're running on? Why did John include this or any of the other miracles?
My answer to everything like that is why not?
Okay, well, we actually have an answer that's a little bit better. I had a professor who, it was Dr. Gibbs. He wrote the Matthew commentary, if you know him. He was a fantastic professor. And someone asked a question once, and it was, Dr. Gibbs, is it possible that, whatever the question was. And Gibbs said, that's my favorite question. Yes, it's possible. Is it likely? That's a different question, right? Is that what happened? I don't know. Is it possible? Anything's possible. So yes, in some sense, we got that. Why not?
Is it possible that he was present for the one but not for the other?
Yes. Unlikely. So one of the reasons I would say it's unlikely that John was not a witness to the centurion is it's secondary evidence, and this comes primarily from Acts. That when the disciples are choosing a replacement for Judas, do you guys remember the criteria?
Yeah, they had to have been with
They had to have been with Jesus from the baptism on. And yes, the disciples do spend time away from Jesus, right? We know from Luke, Jesus sends out the 72. So could it have happened during that? I mean, I don't think it happens with disciples around in the other Gospels, right? Not only that, but it's also, and I mean, we know just from the fact that Thomas isn't with the other apostles, that the apostles aren't always, crowded in a circle with each other, just doing it constantly, right? But it's unlikely that John would have been apart from Jesus because he's part of that inner circle of disciples. There's also, and this is a complete aside, it has nothing to do with any of this, but there's also a thought that I've been convinced by that John was very young now we don't know this, right? These are assumptions being made. But there's a chance that John was very young. I'm talking like he could have been as young as like 12 or 13 or even younger when he's with Jesus. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. One, he lives the longest. And granted, all the other disciples do get killed. But John lives potentially, usually confessional, traditional datings for John's death is, round about the year 100. So that's 70 years after Jesus dies. It helps if he's younger. There's a chance, by the way, that Peter was the only adult disciple, because Peter's the only disciple that Jesus needs to pull a coin out of a fish's mouth to pay the temple tax for. There's just 2 coins, one for Peter, one for me. So it's possible that Peter was the only adult disciple. Also, my favorite reason why I think John was very young when he wrote the gospel is the tone he has in the gospel as he's remembering things. One, it's very clear he never gets over Judas's betrayal. Unlike the other gospels, I guess, this is all my interpretation, right? Unlike the other gospels that can kind of take a little bit of a level stance with Judas throughout the gospels, every time Judas comes up in John like puts this footnote, it's like, that scumbag who betrayed Jesus. We all hated him the whole time, right? And it kind of feels a little immature, almost. And for me, that's someone who was young, who had someone close to him who just utterly wrecked him, and he's never gotten over it. Also, and this always gets put on, funny social media videos and things like that around Easter. John makes a point of, I don't think he got along with Peter. He's like, well, Peter ran to the tomb. I outran him. I got there first. Let's make sure that we all know that, right? And so I think that to me kind of lends to John potentially being very young while he's with Jesus. Now, was he 12 or 13 or was he 30? I don't know. Right, Tom? Why not? It doesn't really matter, but that's kind of my take on things. Do you have anything to add there?
Did they have, bar mitzvahs, did they have certain ceremonies?
No, not like
when you're 14.
not like those.
Okay.
I mean, there were coming of age ceremonies, like bar and bat mitzvahs weren't a thing yet. That comes
Could have been,
much later.
easily could have been like 14.
Yeah, and I mean, again, this is us. It's called third level hermeneutics. We read the text and we use the writing to make an assumption or a guess about the author. It can be pretty tricky to do. Literature classes, you do this all the time, right? What is going through the author's mind when they write this? We can do it with the Bible. We just don't do it a ton, but we definitely do it a little bit. Anything to add to?
Probably the big item in terms of age is Jesus begins his ministry at age 30.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that John is certainly younger than that.
Right. Yeah, it's unlikely he would have disciples older than him. Right, because older was better in their eyes, right? Which is why when Jesus says he's greater than David, the people are like, no, you're not. You know how many grandsons you are of David? Like, he's so much better than you. He's better than all of us because he's older than us, right? And then Jesus says, oh, you think that's a big deal? Well, better than Abraham, too. And then they lose their minds. He also uses the divine name of himself, right? Before Abraham was ego in me, I am. And so they decide to throw him off is that throw him off a cliff or stone? I think that's when stone him, and then he just disappears.
I think John was a seminary student.
Yeah.
Because he apparently was down in Jerusalem studying, because he's familiar to the high priest, familiar enough that the girl at the gate said, "Hey, John, come on in."
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's
and
that's interesting.
he had gone from his studies in Jerusalem to John the Baptist, and that's it's from John the Baptist that he gets his connection to Jesus.
Now, this isn't to say, I mean, we don't know the order John wrote his books. My contention, which I talked about when we did the John's epistles, I think the gospel is John's last will and testament. I think he wrote it like right before he died, because he knew he was going to die, or he started to figure out that he was going to die. Because there's that whole this man won't die until he sees the consummation of the Son of Man and all that. There was an assumption that John wasn't going to die before the end of the world by a lot of people, and probably by John too. And so I think that John waited till.
That's why chapter 21 is put in there.
Right.
To dispel the rumor that he wasn't going to die.
Yeah. In fact, there's a decent chunk of scholars that think that 21 was not written by John. It was written by the elders after he died, to kind of encourage people. But we're talking about miracles. We're getting off on rabbit holes. It's all good.
Did the disciples have wives?
Peter did.
Peter did. The simplest reading of the text says that Peter did. right? Because
Go ahead.
His mother-in-law and a female.
right, you know, Jesus heals his mother-in-law. Now, I know that there are theologians that will jump through barrels and hoops to try and explain how that relation can exist without Peter being married. But yeah, I mean, we could be very confident that Peter was married. Were the other ones married? We don't know. Did they get married after the events of the Bible? That's also entirely possible.
Paul refers to that. Refers to them taking their wives along with them.
Right. Yeah. And what's critical is that the prohibition on marriage doesn't come into the church until the 1100s in the Western Church. And since we're on a tangent anyway, so another reason why the Western Church puts prohibitions on marriage.
Sure.
Yeah.
You're married, you have a kid, and
Yeah.
you have a kid, the kid inherits your property, and the church loses all their property.
Church doesn't want that, right? That's exactly right. If you're married, you have kids. If you have kids, you need to give them an inheritance because that's how you don't become impoverished. And what that would have required was the division of papal lands, right? Because the papacy owned everything that the church owned. And this is why this gets.
That's really a stupid reason.
Well, you say that.
Look what happened.
You don't want to broke.
Well, yeah, okay. So that's what Luther says. Luther talks about that as well. Although there's more going on there. But I mean, you say it's a stupid reason, but holy cats, man! The church got power. Well, because what did an emperor do, or a king, or a duke? What did they do when they died? If they were good and pious,
Give money to the church. I don't know.
they didn't give money to the church. I mean, they did, but that's not important. Who cares about money? We can get that from poor German farmers, right? We don't care about money. What did people who own land do when they died?
Just gave land.
They would chop up their territory, give it to however many of their kids they felt like giving it to. Although they stopped once they realized that this was causing really tiny chunks of land, the primogeniture thing kicked in. But they would divide a portion, 10% or so, of their land and donate it to the closest church, monastery, or directly to the Pope, right? Charlemagne, he gives, right? You know, the original papal states crossed the entire Italian peninsula. It's shrunk due to, a lot of stuff happening over the last 1,600 years, or less than that, 1,400 years. But that was Charlemagne. It's got an official name. Anyway, it's his gift to the church. And what happens over, we'll just say, 1,100. What happens over 500 years of the kings and emperors and dukes and landowners giving, admittedly, small tracts of land to the church, and the church never giving any of it away? What happens? All of a sudden, 500 years later, the church owns a huge portion of Europe. And power is land. And there's lots of other stuff going on as well. So, as a consolidation of power, the prohibition on marriage was extremely effective. It was. By the way, what would you do with your extra kids, right? You have 5 sons, but you're not subdividing your land, because once you do that, then commoners start getting too powerful in relation to how much you have versus how much landed serfs have. So you get your first kid, you give them all your stuff, your first son, right? Forget your daughters. You use them for political currency, right? It's the reality of the way it goes, right? You have daughters so that you can marry them off for peace treaties and things like that. Or so that you can marry your daughter off and get a chunk of land from someone else, right? And this is the reality of the Middle Ages in Europe.
If not, you send them to the convent.
Right, so you would send the ones that you couldn't get anything for to the convent. What do you do with the boys? First boy inherits, right? He's fine. What do you do with all the other boys?
There used to be an order to that.
Priests.
Yeah.
So you have 2 options. Could be priests. Usually it's monasteries.
Okay, I got
which is close but not quite the same. The other option, you become a knight errant, right? You know, all the stories about knights that you know, those are not first sons. The first sons didn't go riding around in armor and having the possibility of getting themselves killed. That's stupid. They stayed at home and lived the good life off of the land and the wealth. All the other sons either went to a monastery or they became knight errants, tried to marry a high-ranking lady and then get a chunk of her land. They would go and fight for other dukes and things, and the dukes would give them land with the agreement that if the duke ever needed someone to fight for them, they were required to go. They would go on crusade to the Holy Land because guess what? You can just take Muslim lands. That's totally fine. You can't take it from that guy over there because he's a Christian. But if a Muslim or a Jew owns it, that's fair game as long as he can take it.
I would say that join the profession, you know, there's blacksmiths and carpenters and
Oh, not if you're a noble.
lawyers and-
No, not if you're a noble. That was for...
No, not for his son.
Right. No.
Because they're nobles.
That was beneath them. Now, when we get deeper in like the Reformation and the Renaissance, then you get a little bit of that, but very, very little. Because artisans, oh man,
Well, who's all the carpenters and things in?
those are people
How
without no
does a
blood.
knight errant get income?
Oh, by fighting people and by doing things and by fighting in tournaments.
In the army, but
Well, armies don't exist. There are no standing armies.
not a standing army, but whenever the king wanted to.
Yeah,
somebody-
and so the way it worked, Tom, is let's say I'm the king. You are a third son of a baron or a duke or something. I want knights in my retinue, and you've been trained, you are functionally capable of being a knight. I say, well, here, I'm going to give you this hunk of land that you can live on. That's yours. But if I ever go to war with the French, you are required to come or I can kill you and give your land to someone else. That's how knights
Well, there
are.
must be a huge number of people in all those professions. They have to come from
They
somewhere.
didn't come from noble families.
Right, they went from commoners.
Commoners.
People outside of the noble blood.
You know, that movie Downton Abbey, I don't know if you ever saw that, but there's this one scene where they're talking about something and they mention the word weekend. And the matriarch of the family says, what's a weekend? Because she's noble, she has never worked, and she has never even known anyone
Yeah.
who's a worker.
They make money off their estate.
So work week had just no concept. They didn't work. That was beneath them.
The system here, which has a name, it's got serfs and anyway, it has a very small class of people on the top and a huge number of people on the bottom.
Feudal system.
Feudal, thank you, Joe. And the Europeans aren't the only ones to do this. Japan is feudal basically till World War II. I mean, feudal systems pop up all over the place. And by the way, just one last little thing here because Luther talks about it. If you went into the monasteries as a second, third, fourth son, you had two options. One was a monastery, like a real monastery, which is the one that Luther was in, that kind of thing. The other were the party monasteries. Think party colleges. They had party monasteries back then. Because think about it. You have a whole bunch of richy rich, never worked a day in their life people who are used to, young men who are used to partying all the time. They don't want to stop and go join the church. What a drag. So they would all go to this certain monasteries with the right reputation. They'd have parties all the time. And Luther rails against this before the Reformation. After the Reformation gets going, he rails against monasticism in general. But yeah, you had party monasteries. They had kids running around. They were licentious houses of drinking and women and it's crazy. You can read accounts and see pictures. They're paintings of these places. They're wild. So you could either go to like one of the real monasteries, or you could go to the monastery and just party for the rest of your life. And your family would be donating money so that you had money to party it up. It's an extremely corrupt system. Anyway, Jesus. So, like I said,
Your original question,
thank you.
why this miracle? I
Right.
think verse 53 explained that John wanted to get to a punchline.
Yes, absolutely. And that punchline is the Father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live, and he himself believed in all his household, right? So, thank you, Joe, for getting us back on track here. Even though I can talk European social, military, political history all night. That's not what we're doing. We have here another inclusio, right? This was a term I introduced to you potentially last week, where we have the inclusio of woman, where Jesus refers to Mary as woman at the wedding at Cana, and then what's the next time he refers to Jesus or to Mary as woman? When he's on the cross, right? And so we see that John is pairing these two events. We have here another pairing, right? One of the hints is they witness X witnesses the miracle and believes, right? The phrase, this was the second sign, right? That's going to pair. What else is another parallel between these two miracles? Verse 46 is your answer here. It's in Cana in Galilee, where he had changed the water into wine, right? So Jesus is in the same place as well. So John is including and kind of putting brackets on this section of reaction to Jesus. And we see here with those who see the miracles are recognizing, at least see them in faith, recognize that Jesus is God. Now, this is a good way for us to transition into verse 48, right? So the officer or the official, which we'll talk about him in a second, I have not as good a transition. The official asks for Jesus to heal his son, and then Jesus replies to him, right? Verse 48, so Jesus said to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe, right? What is Jesus' tone here?
Sounds like he's disappointed.
Yeah, like, oh, yeah, little.
It really does sound, yeah, we got some little face stuff going on. That's not what's happening. That's because this is in English and you don't get the nuance of the Greek here. I set you guys up for it, don't worry. This is one of those places where I hear my Greek teacher, Dr. Veltz, who wrote the Greek grammar, say reading in English is watching in black and white, and reading in the Greek is being at the game, which is it was a great impression, trust me. First of all, who is Jesus talking to when he says this?
I guess the people around him.
It is plural. This is always a problem because in English, you is both singular and plural, and we don't have a written way in proper English to distinguish the two. Greek does. This is plural. Jesus does not say, unless you see these signs. He kind of is talking to the Christ. Says, unless you all see signs, you won't.
That's why we have y'all.
Right, I mean,
Well, you said.
it's wild, right? You're in grad school, right? At the seminary. Grad school. High-level education. Working through Greek text, classical languages. And they prefer you to write down y'all. Because then they know that you know it's plural, right? In fact, you will sometimes, depending on the professor, you'll get marked down if you write you, and it's, oh man, it ends in an os, I don't remember. Anyway, and it's plural. If it's the plural you and you just write down you, some professors will knock you down a little bit. Because you didn't write y'all or use guys is the other one, even though I'm not from the Northeast where apparently that's a thing. But yeah, so they would tell us specifically, put y'all down when you're doing translations, right? High level, classical language, real fancy stuff, write down y'all. That contraction is endorsed by the seminary. So Jesus is talking to y'all. Unless y'all see signs and wonders, you won't believe, right? So he's not chastising this individual, right? He's speaking generally to everyone who is around him. Furthermore, he's not really chastising the man, even though it feels that way. I'm going to say this is similar to Jesus referring to his mother as a woman. It kind of feels punchy and direct. It's not, when Jesus uses that phrase for Mary, it is one of endearment in the way he's using it. It's also it's used with the purpose to separate Jesus from his mother to begin his ministry. Here, the turn of phrase that Jesus uses is a loaded phrase, right? Just like I said when Jesus is talking about his relationship to Abraham, he uses in Greek ego eimi, which is Yahweh, or it's the way the Septuagint renders Yahweh. In Greek, ego eimi, the divine name. To us reading it, you might just say, before Abraham was, I am. That's not a good grammatical sentence, but those people who are kind of in the know and go, oh, hold on, saying I am that's not just Jesus using awkward grammar. He's saying, before Abraham was, I am God. Loaded term. We have a loaded term here, right? The language that John uses here, is the terminology is the same turn of phrase, right? Signs and wonders that is used in the Exodus account. So Jesus is, by his word choice and his language here, we see that Jesus is hearkening us back to the plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea, the signs and wonders. And what was the purpose of the signs and wonders in Egypt? I mean, the purpose is multifaceted, but over the whole thing, what's the purpose of the display of the signs and wonders?
God and your God's
God is God. He's the biggest God. He's the greatest God. All of that. And the Israelites throughout their history are often pointed back. Look to remember the signs and the wonders. That's who your God is, right? So Jesus is saying here, essentially, remember the signs and wonders. If you don't see those signs and wonders, just like the people of Israel and in Egypt, right? You won't believe. Let me show you a sign and a wonder, right? And so Jesus then parts the Red Sea, right? Is kind of the idea here. Go ahead, Bill.
If you say that you is plural,
Yes.
the very next sentence talks about your, which is singular. It's like he's having a conversation as opposed to addressing the group.
All right, I want to do something with you, Bill. We're going to do some dramatic role playing here. I want you to read as the official. Start with, I guess it doesn't quote it, right? So you have said, my son is at the point of death. And then you're going to read the official's lines from here, right? You say, my son is at the point of death. Unless you all see signs and wonders, you'll never believe, right? Talk to the crowd. Now you respond, right? Because you're part of this conversation. So go ahead.
He said, sir, come down before my child. Jesus said to him.
Oh, no, that's my line. Go, your son will live. Right? I mean, do you see kind of, what was that?
He says, your son will live.
Right, that is a singular.
Singular.
Yes,
Right.
yeah, that. So, and Jesus does this a lot, right? I mean, like the centurion, right? Centurion talks to Jesus. Jesus speaks back to the centurion. The centurion says, I don't deserve to have you in my house. I tell people, go, and they go. You do the same thing with the disease. And Jesus stops talking to the centurion for a moment and addresses the crowds and then says, go. Right? So he's in a conversation. Mm-hmm. There's a crowd around him, right? Jesus, unless he's on the Mount of Olives, Jesus has a crowd around him for the most part, right? Yeah, so he addresses the crowd and then he comes back in to talk to that one individual. That's what's going on here. And like I said, in English, you can't really tell that that's what's happening because we don't have, it should say, right? Unless you all see signs and wonders, you'll not believe. It is plural, even though it says said to him, it's a plural word there. And then, right, he says, please come down. She says, no, just go. It's taken care of, right? Good. Questions on that? All right, so who is this official?
study Bible says probably somebody in Herod's court.
Right. So we're not sure exactly. So he's in Capernaum, place that Herod is in control over. So it's probably someone in Herod's court or something similar to that. This is not a Roman, right? Why we are pretty confident this isn't the centurion. So it's an official in Herod's court or under the Jewish oversight committee, if you will, right? And so, who is this person? Well, it's a local, right? Likely a Jewish individual, but are they? Since we're talking about who is accepting Jesus, is he someone that we would expect to accept Jesus? Why or why not?
This reminds me of Jonah. You know, Jonah's a prophet of God, so he should have been happy to witness.
Okay.
Right? We
Yeah.
have the same thing going on with this, you know, and yet the sailors were worried about Jonah's safety.
Right, yeah.
And
So that's what's going on more broadly, but I want to caution that because we know that this official accepts Christ, and he's coming in faith.
I would say
right?
he's Jewish, and I would hope that all the Jewish people would accept Christ.
Right.
Yeah,
Because
but
they're
it's
Jewish.
real early in his ministry.
Okay.
Really not one other miracle.
Right. Okay. So let me rephrase the question. Of the different not people groups, of the different careers, if you will, career paths of this day and age, the people would have expected Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, lawyers, that sort of thing, to be accepting of the Messiah, to recognize him. We recognize they're not doing that, right? Would we expect a Jewish official in the court of Herod to be accepting of the Messiah? No, why not?
Well, because it get kicked out of the temple, for one.
Okay.
And for two, I mean, Jesus basically surrounded himself with sinners and poor people.
Okay, well, that's
sick
part of it.
people and
Yeah.
stuff, so he probably, you know.
He's a corporate shill, right? I'm pretty sure the correct term is he's a scab. He walks the protest line, right? If he's a Jewish person, he's working with the bad guys.
Here's
The Jewish people did not like the Herods. They were, right, the Herodians and the Hasmoneans, right, which remember, there are people alive who remember the Jewish kingdom. They were at war with each other for most of their history. And then the Herodians won because they, you know, played nice with the Romans, and the Hasmoneans sought independence from Rome for historical reasons, and they lost because Rome was like, not happening for historical reasons. The Parthians, boogeymen, right? And so anyone who was working, this is similar to tax collector. It's not a tax collector, but it's in that, and it's not as bad as a tax collector, right? Don't get me wrong. And we can talk about that in just a second here. But he was working for the enemy, right? He was working for the state that was putting his people down, and yet he was working for them, right? And so, no, he's a traitor to his people. Of course, this man won't accept the Messiah, and yet he does, right? By the way, I know I've talked about this before, but I really think it helps an understanding of why people hated tax collectors so much. What did Roman tax collecting look like? You guys remember me telling you this?
They cheated.
So,
More money than
yes and yes, right. So to say they cheated, the Romans would have disagreed with that, right? You know, the mafiosos would have disagreed with that, right? The way tax collection was done in the Roman Empire, across the whole Roman Empire, right? This isn't just special for Judea. Tax collectors were universally hated in Rome because they were not. So I know, how many of you guys watched The Chosen? And right, Matthew might have autism. He's a numbers guy.
Yeah.
That is technically possible historically. It's unlikely, right? Not because they're. I mean, I'm glad that I haven't watched Chosen. I'm glad, inclusive. I'm all for that. That's fine, right? There were autistic people at this point in time. Some of them probably did work as number crunchers and that sort of thing. Right? They were good at it, but. The assumption that because Matthew's a tax collector, he was, He's like Steve, you know, the nerd who did taxes, and, the green visor, all right. That's not how Roman tax collectors operated. Roman tax collectors had big sticks, and they walked around and they told the government, they took bids. The different groups, the different companies, tax companies would give bids from Judea. I can raise 1,000 denarii. I can raise 1,500, right? Highest bidder won. And then what they did is the state, the Roman Empire, did not pay them. That wasn't their job anymore. They were on the hook for what they told the government they would raise, and anything else they took was profit. And it was accepted by the government that is what they were doing, was skimming off the top. As long as Rome got its cut, they didn't care. So this is why Matthew says, you know, anyone who I took more than I needed to, I'll give back and restore however many times. That's a big deal because, first of all, that's Matthew's entire paycheck he stole from people. The Romans didn't see it as stealing. The Jewish people definitely saw it as stealing. But let's say it works out, I need 5 denarii from Jeff. I'm going to come over to Jeff and I'm going to, you know, have the big stick with my goons next to me. I'm going to say, Jeff, you owe me 10 denarii. And he says, well, I can't pay that. I said, well, that's too bad. And then the sticks come out, right? I said, well, thank you for your donation. 5 goes to Rome, 5 goes in my pocket. That's how Roman tax collecting worked. Right. And again, this was empire-wide. It's also why citizens of Rome were exempted from taxes, because they were the people close enough to the people who were getting very rich off of this that they would, you know, riot and kill them. So they got exempted from taxes. But this happened everywhere. The Romans had perhaps the most corrupt tax system in all of history. So when we see Jesus eating with tax collectors, right, that is not different. In fact, it's a little bit worse, but it's not terribly different than Jesus eating with gangbangers who are demanding protection money from local businesses. That's the closest equivalent we have, except it's even worse for them because not only are they gangbangers extorting the place for money, but they're doing it on behalf of the oppressing empire that's putting them down anyway, right? So not only are they traitors to the Jewish people in that sense, but they're also stealing from them with government sanctions, right? So tax collectors are like government authorized, you know, gangbangers who are stealing and getting protection, right? And Jesus says, I'm going to go have dinner with you. And people freak out. And you can imagine why, right? In fact, chances are people would have been more willing to accept Jesus eating with prostitutes. And they're like, okay, I can understand that, right? Tax collectors? No, they were the worst of the worst. But we see constantly that it's prostitutes, tax collectors, officials, the centurion for that matter. These are the people, Samaritans, you know, John the Baptist, who's this weirdo screaming out by a river, you know, who warned you to flee destruction and all that kind of stuff. These are the people that see Jesus, recognize his miracles as him performing signs and wonders and showing himself to be God and believing, right? When they see the miracle, they believe. And that's what John is really getting at here. So good. Questions on that before we push through a little bit more and talk some more about the miracle? All right. So I don't know if you've noticed this. I did for these first 2 miracles that the miracles are kind of boring, right? I mean, maybe this is a strange thing to say, but there's not much narrative. Jesus doesn't do anything. I mean, he does, but it's not. We'll get some with the healing of the Sabbath. You know, Jesus goes to the tomb and yells out, "Lazarus, arise!" as this big old prayer, it's big and showy, right? And granted, that's in John, so we're getting there. But these first 2 miracles, right? Who is even aware that the first miracle happens? Servants, Mary, and his disciples are it. Because Jesus is so low-key about it. He's not over there waving his hands over the jars or anything. Just go fill the jars and give them what you find in there and it'll be fine, right? This miracle, again, Jesus doesn't say anything magic and waves his arms. He just says, your son's fine. Go home. He's good. Right?
Down is 2 sentences.
Yeah, it's very, you blink and you miss it. And so I think, and again, we're going to get to the more dramatic miracles where Jesus is like doing things during his miracles. These are both very simple. Why do you think John writes them like this? I mean, apart from this is how it happened, right? Why? Again, John is including these and he's not including dramatic miracles.
Well, I think it's pretty dramatic for the families. Imagine
certainly.
year after year, the stories, generation to generation. Your great-grandfather.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think, again, we're seeing that emphasis on, it's not the dramatics or anything like that. It's that Jesus is performing these signs so that people would believe, right? I pulled from Rufus Melodius, right? That how did Mary know to expect this sort of thing? And we kind of get that a little bit in some of the way the church fathers deal with this here. Cyril of Alexandria has some really great quotes here, kind of dealing with the interaction between Jesus and this official. And in some ways, Cyril doesn't quite understand the official. Because he makes note that the official recognizes Jesus' miraculous power, right? There's no if you can, he hears that Jesus can do these miracles, and he comes and finds Jesus expecting a miracle, right? Now, at the same token, though, he's convinced Jesus has to be present to perform that miracle. And Cyril has this great quote about this, and Cyril's not super friendly to the official, but he gets there, right? So he says this in his commentary. Why did the Lord need to be present with the sick person, since he can easily heal even one who is absent? How is it not utterly ignorant to suppose that he is superior to death, but to think that the one who is filled with God, befitting power, is in no way God? Right? So what Cyril says, he doesn't quite understand why this man expects Jesus to have power over death. Who has power over death? God, right? Why, just so that we're clear, because the son doesn't die. So why does Cyril say that Jesus has power over death here? Right, this is not a resurrection account. And he knows that, right?
He was on the verge of death.
He was on the verge of death, right? So Cyril is recognizing that this official is expecting Jesus to stop death in its tracks, right? To stop death from overtaking his son. And he says he expects Jesus to be able to do this, but he expects he has to be present, because certainly he can't do it at a distance. Only God could do that, right? Because God fills all things and is in all things. And he really goes on and on and on about that. But so Cyril kind of sees this kind of strange interplay in the official for kind of having, I think in our sense we might say he has belief, and yet he needs help with his unbelief in many ways.
He had faith.
Right, so he does have faith, but Cyril's saying that faith was incomplete. Now, we'll push all the way forward. So he has this great line at the end of his commentary section here. He says that with one word, Jesus, and I didn't quote it, right? But with one word, Jesus heals 2 souls. With one word, he saves 2 men from death, right? Who are the 2 that he saves?
The official and
The official and the son and the official, right? The son from a literal death, and the official from the spiritual death, right?
It says all his household.
Well, yes, and all the household is included, but Cyril is writing in a style that likes that parallel and likes the quippy little phrase to be able to say Jesus healed far more than just those 2.
everybody needs a soundbite.
Yeah, that's honestly what it is, which is kind of weird to think that someone writing in the 400s is thinking about his TikTok clip. But that's basically what's going on here that's a little bit of an irreverent way to put it, but if you read the whole commentary, this is on page like 400. it's very long, even though most of it's on chapter 1. Cyril works a lot with parallelisms and connections. So he will take two things in the Bible in general, pair them with each other in order to interpret them. And so here he's making that point of, with that one word, Jesus heals 2 men. Even though I think it's worth, especially in our context, pointing out the whole household. So even though he doesn't include that, he knew that, right? I think just so we remember, Cyril probably had the Bible memorized. So he knew that it said, and his whole household, right? But he's trying to make that dramatic point.
It seemed like you could make the case that the official had some faith when he came to Jesus.
Yes, yeah, and so, like I said, I think Cyril's building to a crescendo here in his point. But what he's recognizing, he's not the only one, a number of the church fathers make this point, is that while he comes with faith, the faith seems to be that Jesus is a miracle worker, right? We talked about this a little bit last week. What's the difference between Jesus and Elijah, or Jesus and Moses? Right? Both of them are wonder workers. People go to Elijah expecting healing too, right? So what's the difference?
Well, God is working through the other.
Right. So,
Jesus is God.
right. So Jesus is doing this of his own accord is one aspect of it, and that's a critical one here. But what I think the church fathers are trying to pull out of this is the official comes with the faith that God will work through this person, right? Like akin to how he worked through Moses, right? In fact, we're getting similar language here, right? He leaves recognizing, right, after he hears the witness of Jesus, right? Because it isn't noted that he comes to faith when he leaves Jesus, right? When does he come to faith? When is it that he believes?
After he talks to the people.
After he talks to the people, he witness, right? So we have some faith comes by hearing stuff in here, and he realizes that it happened the moment that Jesus said this. And there seems to be, the fathers at least are seeing that a switch is kind of flipped. Not, this is a man from God, this is God. And that's where this distinction seems, at least in their minds, the fathers, when Cyril's reading this, that seems to be what they're recognizing here, is that yes, he came expecting a miracle in faith, in good faith, recognizing that Jesus is from God, right? But by the time the narrative is over, he is not recognizing Jesus as a miracle worker, as someone who is just doing signs and wonders, right? And John the Baptist talks about this, right? Did you come out here to see someone looking crazy? Jesus says, you're only here because I do miracles, that kind of thing. By the time this official is done with the narrative, Jesus isn't just a miracle worker, he's God. And that's the key, right? Remember, when we see that John is saying this person believed, they came to faith. What is that faith in? It's faith, if we're going to really stay tight with the grammatical structure, not grammatical, but with the structure of the book, it's faith in chapter 1. Faith in the Word that has become flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth, the light that has come into the world of darkness. So, God, right? But when we see people in John coming to faith, the faith that they are coming into is into the faith in the incarnate Christ who is here, revealed in John chapter 3. Not right. 15 is better than 16, by the way, or is it? Is it? I'm looking back because now I'm convinced it's 17. No, it is 15, 14 and 15, right? And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. So here we see that kind of conclusion. It is not just that the Word became flesh and is dwelling among us, the tabernacling with us, but that Word that has become flesh is the one who is here to be lifted up for the salvation of man. And so all of these things, everything else that John builds and builds and builds on the work of Christ throughout his whole book, culminating in the death and resurrection of Christ, where it all gets laid out on the table, right? And you can then read back the rest of the book and go, oh, now I understand, which we have the benefit of, we already know how it ends, so we can do that straight out the gate, right? Where we can recognize, this is who Jesus is, right? He's not just some miracle worker. He is God in man for the salvation of humanity, right? Which is why Cyril makes that point. Two men were, he heals two souls. One is the literal healing, but also coming to faith, right, with the household, right? The other, the more important healing, is the healing of the official in his household soul, right? That they are now in faith. They are now right with the disciples and those who are recognizing that Jesus isn't just some miracle worker like the Old Testament. He's the fulfillment of the Old Testament. He is that incarnate among us. Right? Is that a whole? Okay. Questions on any of that while I figure out what in this mess of bullet points I haven't talked about yet? So I'm very out of order. All right, this is going a little bit back, but I think it's worth bearing out again because we're really looking at John's structure here. The central aspect of this miracle, as we've already talked about, is the rescue from death, right? Which, again, is emblematic of Jesus' mission as a whole. And we can see that because the bringing to life is mentioned 3 times, right? Go, your son will live. He was going down a certain man and asked him the hour he had gotten better. And he said, Father knew. Oh, no, I skipped one. As he was going down a certain man and told him that his son was recovering, he asked the hour he got better and said to him, yesterday, the 7th hour, the Father knew that there was the hour that Jesus said to him, your son will live. And he himself believed. There's a 3rd one in there. I double checked to make sure that I wasn't going crazy. Yeah, so I told him his son was recovering. That must have been the other one that I was thinking of. Anyway, we have that 3-fold repetition of your son will live. Life. Life from death as being this central emphasis. And then, right, this miracle brings life from death not only for the son, but for the father and his whole household, right? Why is it important that we recognize this little tagline here, and his whole household? Or in all his household? Why is that important?
One of the reasons Lutherans give for baptizing infants.
Absolutely. This is one of the key reasons that we give for baptizing children, because in all likelihood, children are a part of the household here. And there's certainly not an exception made for children. So the children are coming to faith. Now, this isn't, you're probably thinking more in line of when this same phrase appears in Acts, because it says, he was baptized along with his whole household. So it's more specific, but this is certainly supporting that that kind of track. And whenever, especially a gospel writer, right, because Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, starts using gospel language, there's some continuity going on. So absolutely. So we see that the faith is for the whole household.
Just thinking it's the tradition of Pater Familia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
he comes to faith.
Right.
He takes everybody with him.
So when missionaries went to the Japanese, do you know how they did it? This is back in feudal Japan, even though Europe was out of the feudal age at this point. When missionaries first went to Japan, they very quickly recognized that it was not worth their time talking to common people, which sounds wild. Who did they talk to? No, you couldn't talk to the emperor, right? You couldn't even look at But you're on the right track. They went to the Klan, the leaders of the Klan. Why?
Because if they believe.
So goes the leader.
Yes, yeah. And right. If you could convert the leader of the Klan, everyone went with them by feudal duty and right and that kind of thing. Right. This happens also in Europe, by the way. One of my other professors, Dr. Kolb, someone asked him how long his family had been Lutheran, and Dr. Kolb had all these great answers to questions and little comments that most people, I don't think, understood what he was saying. One was that our class on sin and evil wasn't a lab, meaning that we weren't going to practice sin and evil. And he kept repeating that joke, and I don't think anyone got it other than like 3 of us who were giggling in a corner. Anyway, someone asked him how long he and his family had been Lutheran. He was like, this dude's been recognized by European monarchs for his contributions to theology, Lutheran theology. They said, oh, my family became Lutheran when we were marched down to the river at the point of a Roman sword. And I don't think most people understood what was going on. What was happening is way back, after the Roman Empire was Christian, they would go fight these Germanic tribes. And when they won, they would kind of say to the leaders of the tribes, well, you got 2 choices. We kill all of you, or you guys go get baptized. And the leaders often said, okay, baptism it is. And so they would get marched down, and anyone who left, the Romans would just kill. Right? That's, the point of a sword missionary work. And so his comment was like, his family's been Christian, and then he makes the comment. It's a layered comment, right? But forever, basically. But yeah, so this sort of thing, it happens in Europe too. You gotta love it. It's not Clovis. It's one of the German guys. We have quotes. He's in some battle, and his wife was a Christian, and he didn't want to baptize his son for all sorts of reasons. And well, he baptized his first 2 sons, and then they died, and so he's not baptizing the 3rd one. And he's in a battle, and he's losing. And then the quote that we have is in perfect Queen's English. This German barbarian says, "O Lord, if thou shalt give me the victory, I and all my men shall be baptized this very evening." And then he wins, and they all go get baptized, right? As Pastor Schutzke, who you guys have met, the guy that did the Luther thing, he always said, and I'm sure he had that conversation on the battlefield while he was swinging an axe around trying not to die. But that's how a lot, and if the warlord does it, you're doing it too if you're under him. So we kind of get this sense of, it's also a cultural thing we got to remember, you and I talked about this today on a podcast that's upcoming. This is not the modern Western world. This is we've been saying it, right? If the patriarch of your household becomes a Christian, everyone is a Christian because you follow what the patriarch says, right? And this goes even more to the point of children being in the household, because let's say this official is 70 years old. He might have great grandkids in his household, right? They're still in his household. If they're under his roof, which you were under your parents' roof, well, you built a roof next to their roof and you shared a wall with them, you were the mikvah. But you had the patriarch of your family unit, and he was over everyone. And that would have included grandkids and in-laws, potentially, or like daughters-in-laws, especially, their kids, maybe your cousins, depending on how the ascension took place. Your grandfather was the original patriarch, and you're from the top male son line, and now you got to take care of your cousins, maybe even an uncle you got to take care of because you happen to, all that kind of stuff. And that's, when it says his whole household, we could be talking, we're not talking, the nuclear family unit of 2 parents and 3.5 kids or 2.5 kids or whatever it is, right? We could be talking 30 or 40 people. It would not be an unreasonable estimation here. And so this is a kind of a cultural thing that we see, which lends, again, extra credence to, well, it's not like if he had an adult kid, we're only talking about him and his wife, and that's the whole household. No. We're potentially talking a large number of people, extended family units, which are basically at all times going to include children because, well, for many reasons, some of them biological, some of them practical. You don't stop having kids in your family. You just keep going with kids till you can't anymore, and then they're having kids at that point, and you're done. So there are always children in family units here. It would have been exceedingly rare for a household not to have young children. All right. We see this as the second of his signs while he's in Cana, and John is wrapping up what a lot of people who do outlines call the first unit in John, where we see Jesus revealing himself, who he is, and we get to see people's reactions to who Jesus is, right? And they range everywhere from instantaneous faith to get out of here, I want nothing to do with you. And in many ways, they are the ones you don't expect in each of those categories. Good questions before we got a couple minutes. So any other questions or comments, thoughts on this miracle in particular? We're going to go to the Pool of Bethesda next week, which is a weird story. Or at least the context is a weird one where we get like some angel poking his finger in a pool and stuff like that. So we will be, right, I'm not crazy, that is the correct one, right?
I think they did
Okay,
a really
good.
good job with that one in The Chosen.
I've heard that that's a very
That's like-
interesting
It was
section.
really,
so.
I thought they did a great job. I was like
Yeah, I will say and
in awe.
my comments, I haven't watched The Chosen. I tend not to like that kind of stuff because as a pastor, I'll get irritated about little things that aren't worth getting irritated about, right? And
You should watch it with Vanjie then.
well, that'd be even worse, right? No, my mother watched The Chosen, is watching. I know they were doing a movie. Has that come out? Are they done with it? I don't know. Anyway, and she kept trying to get me to watch it. It's like, I have other things I want to watch first. But, I think dramatic retellings of biblical events in general, I think can be good because even when they get it wrong, you should be noticing that, right? As you're watching it, go read the appropriate sections and say, oh, well, this is where they took artistic license. This is where, sometimes you can say, oh, well, this is where they're making a point, right? Because what is The Chosen about? What's the point of The Chosen or any other biblical movie or media?
The life of Jesus.
No, for the most part, no. Usually it's some form of social commentary on current events. And that's why is Matthew autistic? I mean, there's been plenty of media about Jesus and the 12 disciples. I think it's the first time they ever have someone with autism in there.
Yeah, that's true.
So what we can say is, and like I said, this is extremely common. In a very dramatic fashion. You guys hear all the drama about the most recent big Jesus Christ Superstar? And I'm not going to talk about it. But that was very much, Jesus Christ Superstar in general was commentary on modern societal things using the foil of the gospel narrative. Now, it can also teach us about the gospel. One thing I like about gospel shows and media and things like that is it can help you get into the text in a way that you weren't before. And I don't mean reading to check for errors. I mean, I always envisioned that this was happening on a snowy mountain, but turns out it was in the middle of a marketplace, right? You can, I once had someone who was a teacher of exegesis say, he was talking to pastors, and he said, before you preach a text, you should be able to smell it. And so what he meant by that is, like in this case, right, what do the sweaty crowds around you smell like? Get yourself so incorporated into the story. Now, obviously, that's not going to be true of Paul's epistles, right, because they're not narrative, right? If you're preaching on a narrative, get yourself so incorporated into it that you can smell it, right? this happened to me recently. I'm going to share it because I got 5 minutes, and I think this is great, right? I was listening, I was at a pastor's circuit meeting, and during Lent, and the guy preached on the Nunc Dimittis, the presentation to Simeon, because it was a festival in the church year that kind of fell at a weird time, right? That's an Epiphany text. You don't read that 2 weeks before Good Friday. But for whatever reason, it struck me. Could you imagine being Joseph when Jesus was presented? So over the course of 8 days, you've traveled all over the place, right? From Nazareth to Bethlehem. Now you're in Jerusalem because you gotta, pay the purification tax. You just want to get this thing done. You're sick and tired of the world around you. You've just come in from, you didn't have the sacrifice, so you had to go to those money changers who are scamming you, and Joseph's all mad. Obviously, I'm importing things. Joseph's all mad because he got scammed, and he's like, that pigeon should not have cost that much. That turtle dove, I got a highway robbery. And Mary's always like, Joe, just calm down. Don't worry about that. It's a happy day, right? And they're walking in, and then some random dude walks over, grabs your baby, and starts singing about dying and the consummation of Israel, right? And as you're kind of freaking out about this, then the weird old church lady comes up and starts shouting about Jesus too. Could you imagine being Joseph? Or Mary, or anyone, just sitting there going what is happening right now, right? I mean, it's just this, but when we read it, it's like, oh, well, then Mary and Joseph walked in. Or they didn't walk because their halos would have gotten dirty as they floated into the temple. Simon gracefully flittered over, and Jesus floated into his hands so that he could sing this pretty song, right? The way we read the Bible, just because it's a book, right, and we're reading it, is so sanitized, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but one thing that media can do is help get into the hustle and bustle in the context of what's actually going on. What might this, right? It wasn't quiet when any of this stuff was happening.
Think about washing somebody's feet. No socks.
Yeah.
How often did they bathe? Walking around. I mean,
in the desert.
If you really
or
start
not the
thinking
desert.
the reality about it,
Well, there's a reason that was the job for the lowest servant, right? Yeah, so, get yourself into the text. And media can help do that because, how many of you guys just off the cuff know cultural mores of the day, right? You probably don't. If it's a good show, they have historians and anthropologists and archaeologists that are like, well, this is what it would have been like. So they can help you with that and kind of get you into the text a little bit more. I think that's good. I think that stuff's really good. But yeah, I always have fun thinking about what point the producers are making. Why'd you put that in there? Because it's not about Jesus, right? It's about something happening now, right? Anyway, so anything else? All right, well then we will meet next week. I have a conference coming up and I'll warn you before that. So yes, we are meeting next week. And then let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever.